It started with something that most individuals would not even hear, a barely audible, quiet cry down the hallway. Not the sort of loud, yelling cry you would anticipate from a child, but a quiet, delicate cry that grabbed at your chest before your brain could even register. Little Av, 7 years old, sat on the chilly tile floor outside classroom 3B, her arms clutched around her knees, her small shoulders quivering like leaves in the breeze. Her whole world had been turned around, and for an autistic child, even a minor alteration can be a storm. That morning, her teacher had rearranged the seating chart. To everybody else, it was nothing. But to Ava, it was chaos. Her order was disrupted, her territory no longer hers, and that was enough to make her spin into confusion and silence. Children walked by, some gawked, others whispered, but nobody ever stopped. Nobody had any idea what to do. Until Walter walked down the hallway. He wasn't a teacher, not a counselor, just the janitor. But in that moment, he alone could see her. Not glance at her, but see her. Walter was 60 at the very least, his hands rough with years of labor, his gait steady but measured. He'd spent more years in these corridors than most of the employees put together, mopping, repairing, observing life pass in tiny fragments, and something in Ava's immobility brought him to a halt. He didn't utter a word. He didn't question. He just reached into his work cart, grasped a little plastic bottle, twisted off the cap, dipped the wand, and blew. Bubbles. Dozens of them. They drifted and glowed through the golden afternoon light, whirling like tiny planets around her. And Ev looked up. Her eyes widened just a fraction. Her tears ceased. And then, softly, quietly, she smiled. Just like that. That single little act, so effortless, so kind, ignited something neither of them could have conceived. And now I want to ask you something. How many times do we pass by people who are slowly shattering? How many times do we fail the opportunity to turn someone's day, possibly their life, around because we're too busy, too absorbed, or just uncertain? Walter was no sort of trained specialist. He didn't arrive with badges or plans. He merely gave what the rest of us tend to forget we need to offer: presence and a touch of heart. And what he didn't realize at the time was that someone else had been observing. At the end of the school pickup line, in the rear of a black SUV behind tinted glass, a woman sat quietly holding her steering wheel. She had piercing eyes, high cheekbones, and the sort of quiet intensity born from many years of having to make high-stakes decisions. Her name was Claire Whitemore, CEO of Whitemore Ventures, one of the most influential and respected businesswomen in the whole state. She'd won over boardrooms, held together mergers, and weathered corporate hurricanes. But when it came to her daughter, she was utterly powerless. Claire had the finest therapist, private care, even experts flown in from around the nation. Ava's far away though, coiled in her own universe. Claire adored her daughter with all she had, but for the life of her, she couldn't seem to get to her. That was until she met Walter. Each day thereafter, Claire started coming earlier, lingering a little later, her eyes following the serene old custodian who seemed somehow to calm her daughter's nervous little heart. One afternoon, she even got out of the car. The playground was emptying out, the sun setting behind the high school fence. Walter and Ava sat under the oak tree, bubbles drifting in the soft breeze. No words were spoken between them. None were needed. Claire walked slowly across the grass and called out, "Excuse me." Walter turned. "Yes, ma'am." She took a breath. "I'm Ava's mother." Walter smiled gently. "She's a bright one. Just needs a little stillness sometimes." Claire's throat tightened. "I've watched you. The way she answers you. No one else can reach her like you. I don't know how to describe it." Walter shrugged. "Children don't require fancy words. They need someone who can see them." There was a considerable silence, punctuated by the gentle rustle of leaves and the gentle pop of a bubble breaking. Then Claire asked, "Would you spend more time with her? Not as a janitor, as a friend, a guide, someone she can rely on?" Walter was uncertain, not trained for that. He spoke softly. "You don't need a degree to be kind," Claire answered. "Pay me whatever you want." Walter shook his head again. "Don't need your money. Just give me a seat in her corner, a quiet space, and perhaps a bottle of bubble solution every now and then." Friends, I want you to take a moment and reflect on something. When is the last time someone really saw you? Not glanced over at you, not spoken over you, but saw you? That's what this story is actually about. Not bubbles, not titles, but about what it means to see someone, to meet them where they are. And sometimes it's those who are so quiet that they are crying the loudest for someone to hear them. Walter didn't arrive to be a hero. He just stayed. Every day he'd visit. No demands, no fanfare, just patience, just compassion. And as weeks became weeks, Ava transformed. She began laughing. She began humming. She began whispering small words. One day she reached out, grasped her mother's hand, and kept it. That was the day Claire understood. This wasn't just about Ava. This was about her too. Slowing down, listening, learning. And that's when healing started. Not for a child, but for a mother, and for a man who just cared enough to be there. It started with a sound that the average person wouldn't have heard, but to Walter, it was unavoidable. A muffled, soft cry reverberated through the still hallway of Westbrook Elementary, a cry that didn't call out to be heard, but required it more than anything. It wasn't bellowed or crazy like children sometimes do. It was the sort of sorrow that settles low and still, like a pain wisp left inside a small heart. And there, sitting by herself on the hard tile floor outside of classroom 3B, was a small girl named Av. She was only 7 years old, knees drawn up close to her chest, her tiny hands wrapped around her sleeves as if they were the only things holding her together. Her large brown eyes held confusion and fear, looking directly in front of her at nothing, her breathing ragged and shallow. It wasn't like the other children. She didn't volunteer in class or gossip with classmates at recess. Av was autistic, and the world tended to be too loud, too quick, and too uncertain for her. She felt safe in routine, quiet, and predictability. But today was different. Her teacher, experimenting with something new, had redone the room arrangement, a minor change for most. For Ava, a storm. Her comfortable desk was missing, her area thrown into disarray, and in her soft world, that was all it took to shatter her. She'd walked out of the room without a word and sat herself down in the hallway, struggling to suppress a tide of emotions she didn't know how to describe. The teachers within were preoccupied with a full classroom to teach. Students passed by her, some inquiring, some apathetic, but none of them lingered. No one noticed her hurt, no one. Except for Walter. Walter had been the janitor at the school for years. He wasn't a talkative man, but he had this silent knowledge and this heart that had witnessed a great deal of things. In his early 60s, with gray in his temples and hands roughened from work, Walter had passed most of his life playing jobs that kept him out of the spotlight, cleaning, repairing, watching. But he had always noticed the ones people overlooked, and today, Ava captured his heart. He didn't question her what was wrong. He didn't attempt to assure her that everything would be all right. He merely did something, so simple that it was more powerful than 100 nice words. Walter reached into the bottom tray of his rolling cart for a tiny bottle of bubbles, the kind you see in a dollar store, with a bright colored cap and a plastic wand. He slowly twisted the lid off, bent down a few feet from Ava, dipped the wand, and carefully blew. And in an instant, bubbles filled the air, dozens of them drifting, twirling, catching the golden afternoon sun through the high windows. Some settled onto Ava's shoes, others danced around her face and burst with a faint tap. At first, she didn't stir, but then she blinked. Her body relaxed, and as one shining bubble rested on her knee and exploded silently, Ava smiled. Now, this wasn't any ordinary smile. It was the sort that develops gradually, such as sunlight seeping into a dark room. For a boy who never displayed emotions in public, it was as if one were to observe a flower opening in the dead of winter, and Walter noticed it. He did not applaud or rejoice, he merely gave her a little, understanding nod, as if to say, I see you, and that, right there, is where this tale really begins. Because that little thing, the silent decision to sit, to blow bubbles, and to just be present, sparked a chain of events that would alter 3 lives in ways no one could imagine. It's said that great miracles are small, and this was one of them. At that instant, Av had felt safe, heard, seen, and Walter. Well, Walter had inadvertently walked into the most significant work of his career, not as a custodian, but as a reassuring presence in the life of a child who needed peace more than discipline. That's the first thing I want you to keep in mind here. Sometimes the most loving things we do are the ones that are the loudest. We don't have to do everything. At times, simply being there is the best gift we can provide. And believe me, this isn't the last you'll be seeing of just how much impact that little moment would have. Because what Walter didn't realize, was someone was observing. Someone with great power. A person who hadn't been able to connect with Ava the way he had just done. And that person was going to alter everything. Every day after that first moment in the hallway, Walter found time for Ava, and it wasn't just because it was in his job description, but because something about that little girl touched his heart in a way nothing else had in years. Started incorporating it into his quiet routine. mopping floors and repairing broken faucets, of course, but also standing quietly outside classroom 3B for a few minutes when he knew Ava could use some peace. Sometimes he brought bubbles again, always taking care not to burst them too close. Other days, he had small treasures in his pocket, a handful of shiny marbles that reflected the sun, feathers he picked up on his way to school, or small paper cranes he made from scraps of notebook paper during recess. None of it cost him a dime, but each object had a secret magic. Ava never requested them, but when Walter held out his hand for her to see, her eyes kindled just enough to make him feel seen, and that was sufficient thanks. And each day, something miraculous occurred. Ava started waiting for him, not in any overt manner. She wouldn't shout or wave or scream out his name, but she'd stay in the hallway a little longer, or stand by the window at the same hour every day. Her universe, often overwhelming, seemed a little smaller, a little more secure when Walter was around. And for Walter, a man who'd spent most of his life under the radar, there was something therapeutic in that as well. But what they didn't realize was that their little secret connection wasn't as anonymous as they believed. Because every day after school, around time for pickup, parked unobtrusively at the far end of the lot in a shiny black SUV, someone had been observing. Her name was Claire Whitemore, and if you resided in that region of the state, you'd know her exactly. CEO of Whitemore Ventures, one of the largest investment companies on the West Coast, Claire was ruthless, intelligent, famous for closing multi-million-dollar deals by lunchtime and flying across the country in the same day to broker mergers most individuals could only imagine. Yet despite all her business success, there was one thing she'd never quite worked out: how to bond with her daughter. Ava's her sole child, born after Claire had devoted everything to her work. She'd employed top physicians, the most qualified therapists, private caretakers, and even enrolled Ava in a high-end school with special programs. But nonetheless, there had always been a chasm, something Claire could never touch no matter how diligently she approached it. Numplots this a spall to textbull. Ava didn't react to compliments, didn't respond to high-end toys, and didn't take refuge in the trappings money could offer. Claire, who had always been successful by planning, measuring, and accomplishing, was at a loss when it came to being a mother, and so, on cue, she would arrive at the school each morning early, not because her schedule permitted it, but because she required those brief moments of quiet to observe from behind the tinted glass as her daughter navigated her universe. But then, one afternoon, she saw something different. She saw the janitor, the older man with the hesitant gait and gentle eyes, drop down beside Ava and blow bubbles into the air. Claire looked at her daughter's face. She did not shudder. She did not weep. She smiled, and Claire stopped. It was a little thing. But for a mother who'd spent years trying to get even the slightest reaction, that smile was a sunrise. And Claire watched over the next few days. She noticed how Walter never pushed, never spoke too loudly, never loomed. He just appeared, with bubbles, with marbles, with quiet, and Ava reacted. There was quiet in her, a sort of calm Claire had never witnessed before. She was shaken by it. She'd constructed a life upon the notion that achievement was wrought from control, from specificity. But this man, with his humble nature and soft hands, had accomplished something none of her schemes ever had. He'd touched her child, and that lingered with her, long after she drove away from the school parking lot, long after the board meetings and emails ceased. It remained in her chest, a question she could not answer. How had he managed it? And why could she not? That is the point where everything changed. Because in the quiet areas of that school, a quiet janitor was achieving far more than he cleaned. He was constructing trust, bubble by bubble. And a mother who had constructed steel and glass towers was soon to discover that the most significant bridge in her life could not be constructed with plans or money, but with presence. That's your second hook, right there. Occasionally, it is not the one who knows the most that will change everything. It is the one who merely listens, observes, and appears without expectation. And Claire, strong as she was soon to embark on the most humbling experience of her life, all due to a man she hadn't even seen until now. Claire Whitemore had spent her entire life constructing things, large things. She had constructed companies from scratch, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, and navigated boardrooms with a self-assurance that made people stand back in admiration. Business was second nature to her. Numbers, timelines, management, those were her instruments. She could walk into mayhem and create order simply by looking. But the one thing Claire had never been able to construct was a link with her daughter that scared her more than anything. Motherhood, for Claire, was never the unknown. She had prepared as she always did, by securing the best assistance Ava had the most skilled therapists, finest private tutors, an array of specialists who knew how to work with children with autism. Claire left no cost behind, but despite all that machinery of support, the fact was, she had never really known her daughter. Ava existed in a still and silent world, one in which feelings did not necessarily ride the surface and words were hard to find. Claire, with all her brains and resources, had been like a foreigner outside a door she could not figure out how to open, and then one day that door creaked open, but not for her. It had happened in the most ordinary of ways, by a janitor, by Bubbles, by a gesture of kindness. Claire had observed it from the comfort of her car, parked at the boundary of the school parking area as she did daily. But today, there was a difference. She saw Walter crouch beside Ava once more. No grandstanding, no boisterous greeting, just quiet presence, a tiny bubble bottle in his hand. He blew, and the air was filled with iridescent rings of light. Claire's breath caught as she watched Ava raise her head and track the bubbles with her gaze, and then the smile, a genuine one. Soft but unmistakable. It was the sort of smile Claire had asked to see, had struggled to earn, had hired others to induce, and yet, here it came from this man, this unassuming older man with scuffed shoes and gentle eyes. Claire was shocked, overwhelmed in a way that left her bereft of breath. She had constructed a world of order where things belonged, and yet here sat a stranger who, without attempting to impress, had accomplished what she could not. And as she sat there, her hands clutching the steering wheel a little too hard, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: shame. Not the shame of business failure. No, this was another thing altogether. This was the gentle, aching awareness that she had been so intent on getting it all done properly that she had lost the chance to just be present. Observing Walter with Ava was like observing someone play a tune off memory while she was still trying to decipher the sheet music. And that hurt her badly, because this wasn't about who was wealthier, or smarter, or more talented. It was about connection, about presence, and Walter possessed it. She didn't know anything about him, didn't know if he had children of his own, but she recognized something genuine in the way he interacted with, of not out of pity, but out of patience. Not out of strategies, but out of stillness, and I've yielded to that like a flower tilting towards sunlight. Claire had to confess to herself. She'd never attempted that before, never simply sat, quietly, without attempting to repair or alter or direct. She'd always filled stillness with teaching, and filled her calendars so completely there was no room for quiet hours. But Walter introduced room, and in that room, Ava felt safe. That knowledge awakened something deep in Nain. Claire equal measures of wonder and sorrow, because here she was, a mother with all the tools at her disposal, but she had lost sight of what her daughter needed most: calm, time, and someone who saw her just as she was. Here's your hook, right here. Because a lot of us, particularly those of us who've worked hard and done everything right, come to a point where we see that love isn't effort or money. It's presence, it's noticing. And Claire was just starting to learn that lesson. Riding in her luxury SUV, seeing a custodian with a plastic bottle of bubbles get it done, what a group of experts hadn't. Claire didn't feel powerful. She felt humbled. And in that humility was the beginning of something new. She didn't realize it yet, but she was standing at the threshold of a turning point, not only for Ava, but for her too. Because the thing is, healing tends to begin in the quietest corners. And sometimes it's the one you least expect to teach you that you learn the most from. Walter wasn't a therapist, he wasn't a doctor, but in that instant, Claire knew something simple and certain: he knew her daughter, and now she wanted to know too. It was a mellow Thursday afternoon when Claire made a choice that did not come from her calendar, her assistant, or her normal instincts. It came from her heart. For weeks, she'd been observing behind glass, attempting to interpret the silent connection growing between her daughter and the school janitor. But today, something drew her forward. She pulled into Westbrook Elementary a little earlier than she normally did, pulled into a spot behind the school, and for the first time in far too long, got out without glancing at her phone. She did not hurry. She did not have a plan. She just stood against the front door, waiting, looking. Across the playground, she saw them, Walter and Ava, just as she had previously spotted them. They were making their way slowly across the playground to the edge. Ava wasn't talking, but Claire didn't need to hear to know what was going on. Her daughter's little hand stretched out slowly and touched the stream of bubbles Walter sent floating from the wand. The two of them glided along like music and beat. No sound, no hurry, just peace. And Claire, who'd built her life over the years with intention and accuracy, felt something awake deep inside of her. Here's your hook right here, because the most important moments in life tend to come out of nowhere, and the smallest actions can pack the heaviest significance. When Walter turned to head back towards the building, Claire felt herself moving forward, her voice unsteady but firm. "Excuse me," she said. Walter glanced up, obviously startled to be spoken to, particularly by someone like her. "Yes, ma'am," he replied kindly, adjusting the strap of his work apron. Claire took a breath. "I'm of his mother." His face changed. The lines around his eyes softened, and a gentle smile touched the corners of his mouth. "She's a bright one," he said with quiet certainty. "Just needs a little stillness sometimes." Claire's heart caught at those words. How was he so able to understand her daughter when he never once reviewed her file or attended a consultation? She slowly nodded, her voice softer now. I've been observing you, what you do for her, the way she reacts to you. It's something no one else has succeeded in doing. Not therapists, not teachers, not even me." Walter shrugged humbly, his eyes a little embarrassed at the compliment. "Children don't require sound," he said softly. "They require someone to notice them." Claire felt that settle deep, because for all her love, all her trying, perhaps she hadn't seen Ava, least of all, in the way Walter had. There was a silence between them, the kind that hangs heavy, but with a sense of significance, like a door opening slowly. Claire hesitated, and then spoke the question that had been weighing on her chest for days. Would you spend more time with her?" she asked, her voice practically shaking. "Not as a janitor, as a friend, or a guide, someone she can trust." It was reflexive. Money had always been her solution, but Walter shook his head again. "I don't want your money," he said, his calmness freezing her in place. She blinked, flummoxed. "Stas." Walter took a moment of silence. His eyes searched hers, not with judgment, but with concern. "I'm not trained for that," he said. Claire nodded. She had wanted that response, but then she turned and looked at him. Really looked at him and said, "You don't need a degree to have a kind heart." The words shocked her as much as anyone, but she meant them. And in the instant, something changed between them. There wasn't tension, only quiet truth. Then she said, "I'll give you whatever you want in." "What do you want?" she said, really not knowing. Walter hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Just give me a chair in her corner," he said. "A quiet place where I can sit when she needs me, and maybe a box of bubble mix every now and then." Claire was taken aback. No conditions. No deals, just kindness, pure and simple. That response, that humility, opened something up in her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't on her knees negotiating some deal. She was being extended grace. And here's your second hook, because occasionally life tells us that the most precious things in life are not given from power, riches, or rank, but from acts of love. Claire offered her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with feeling. Walter agreed, accepting nothing short of the privilege of being there. At that moment, something lovely occurred. Not a deal, not a business alliance, but a mutual understanding between two individuals, one looking for her child and the other merely glancing at her. And that was healing's beginning, not merely for Av, but for Claire as well. The transformation did not occur overnight, but like the gradual dawn of the sun following a lengthy still night, it arose consistently, softly, and lovely. In the weeks that passed between their talk, Walter spent an hour every day with Ave after school. It was never structured. There were no charts, no agendas, no rigid schedules, just time. They sat sometimes under the ancient oak tree in the school's rear where the sunlight dappled through the leaves, in soft golden bars. Sometimes they strode the deserted corridors, sneakers crunching softly over pristine tile, neither of them talking much. And that was the magic of it. No pressure, no urgency to perform, to improve, or to belong. Just quiet, comprehension, tolerance, and of course, bubbles. Always bubbles. Those humble little balls of happiness were their common tongue. MP and Duck. Walter would draw one from his jacket pocket, dip it into a tiny bottle, and let the breeze take care of the rest. The bubbles capered, floated, burst, sometimes beneath Ava's fingertips, sometimes high over her head, and with each curl of wind, something within her relaxed. Gradually, she started opening up. Initially, there was laughter, soft to begin with as a chime catching the faintest of breezes, then the humming soft songs that had no rhythm but held peace in each note, and then the words. They came gradually, one syllable at a time, with care and treasured. And one afternoon when the sun was low and the playground was still, Eve turned to Walter, put her hand on his arm, and softly whispered a single word. Walter. That's all. Just his name. But to him, it was more than a lifetime of accolades. His eyes welled up with tears, and while he said nothing in that instant, he took a step away quietly for a second to rub his eyes behind his hand. He'd worked with tools, machines, and mops his entire life, but never anything that had made him feel as dignified as to hear that small voice pronounce his name. Here's your hook right here, because sometimes the best breakthroughs don't arrive with fireworks or a standing ovation. They arrive in whispers, in tiny steps, in the soft unfolding of trust. And though Ava was transforming, so was Claire. Initially, she stayed at arm's length. She still observed from a distance, sitting in her SUV with the engine turned off, fearful of disrupting the magic that was happening. But day by day, something changed. She started stepping out, standing a little closer, inquiring softly. She even ended up sitting on the grass with them, her designer suit jacket folded carefully next to her, attempting to blow bubbles with the same soft gentleness she observed in Walter. It wasn't natural to her initially. Claire had never been still. Her entire life had been about motion forward, upward, faster, stronger. But in that small patch of peace, with her daughter and the man who was their silent anchor, she began to learn how to take it easy, how to sit, how to listen. And on one afternoon, sitting under the canopy of the oak tree, something occurred which Claire would never be able to forget. Observing the bubbles drift between them, extended not for the bubbles this time, but for her mother's hand. Small, dainty fingers wrapping lovingly around Claire's. A small action, but to Claire it was everything. She clutched her daughter's hand as if it were the most delicate treasure in the world. Her throat constricted, her heart burst, and when she looked up at last, her eyes caught Walter's. There were tears in them, but they weren't sad. They were full, grateful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. Walter smiled, a small, wise smile that said a lot without saying too much. "You didn't need me, Claire," he said softly. "You just needed to slow down long enough to see her." And in that single sentence, everything made sense. It was not who knew the answers. It was who made the space. Claire had spent years attempting to repair the thing that wasn't broken, trying to make Av into the something that she believed she needed her to be, rather than loving her exactly as she was. But Walter, he had only seen her. And because of that, Ava had flowered. Here's your last hook, and perhaps the most critical one, because sometimes the most profound healing is not in doing more, but in doing less. In being present. In allowing love to be quiet and authentic. That day, under the tree, there were no heroic speeches, no melodramatic goodbyes. Just three of them sitting together, sharing the same soft breath, observing the bubbles rise up into the late afternoon light. And as they vanished one by one from view up into the sky, so too did the burden Claire had borne for so long. Not because all was well, but because at last it was real. And that's how it all went down. Not with headlines or fanfare, but with a mop, a child who barely ever spoke, and a mom who had everything she could want except one thing she needed most: connection. It was never about expensive programs or professional tricks. It wasn't about money, credentials, or flawlessly designed routines. It was about presence. A quiet man, unseen by so many, elected to notice a little girl who had learned to hide in silence, and through an act as humble as a bottle of bubbles, he provided her with what no one else could. A place where she could be herself without judgment, without expectation. A place where quiet was safe. And in the process, he unwittingly allowed a mother to rediscover what it was really like to see her child. Walter didn't have an agenda or a title, but he did possess something much more: formidable patience, gentleness, and time. And in the modern world, those are not only forgotten, they're not valued. But what this story tells us is this: sometimes the most profound healing starts with the smallest gesture. Sometimes the true breakthroughs happen when we give up on trying to get things right and begin to simply be present. Over and over, with an open heart and welcoming hands. Regardless of whether you are a parent, teacher, neighbor, or someone who is simply passing by, there is strength in your presence. There is enchantment in noticing the quiet ones. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to be seen, heard, and loved in our own way. And sometimes all it takes is a moment, a bubble, and someone willing to sit in the stillness with us. Undefined, that's a lesson worth remembering. Undefined and maybe, just maybe, that's what makes a story like this matter most.